Howdy and welcome to the workshop. Today we'll be making an extension fence for the miter gauge on my table saw. Let's get to work.
Because this will be a high use item, it's important to use a hard wood. As well, the dimensions of your project can be varied from mine because of the table saw needs. I'm working with 1x3 poplar. The fence will attach directly to the miter gauge which came with my table saw. I will attach it with insert nuts for wood and machine screws. The insert nuts will not be added until after the glue up. We find their location at this point so that we might know where we can place a metal support bar. The metal support bar will run in a groove in the center of our fence. We can cut this out on the table saw. Aluminum is a good choice for a metal support bar as it will not damage a carbide tip saw if it is accidentally cut. The aluminum bar I am using is 1/8 by 3/4. It isn't necessary for the bar to run the entire length of the fence. Stop the bar a few inches from the edge of the fence, which will run next to the saw. This fence will incorporate a stop block which will run on a T-track on the upper portion of the fence. Measure out the T-track to adjust for the size of your T-slot bolts. I had to run the workpiece over the table saw blade multiple times while slowly raising the blade till I achieved the desired depth. With the groove cut out, we can now cut off some of the waste to open up this into a T-track. This is a cut similar to that which you would do for a rabbet. With all the appropriate grooves cut out of our two sides of the fence, we can secure the aluminum bar in place. I chose to use wood glue. However, you can also use CA glue or epoxy for that purpose, but wood glue to hold the two sides together. Here I tried to fill in the unused portion of the groove for the aluminum track with some pine. That was unsuccessful in this attempt, but after the glue up I was able to pound a little bit of wood into that slot to cover that hole. With the main glue up underway, it's now time to start working on the slider for the stop block. The slider shares the same width as the miter gauge extension fence, and we don't get very far here before we have to do another glue up. After the glue has set, I can remove the clamps and begin tuning the fence. Sandpaper adhered to melanin will allow you to flush up the glue job and true the fence. Once again, measure out the location for the insert nuts. This time we want to set the fence so that way it'll lean over a little bit on the saw. So that way when we use it the first time, the saw will trim off a small amount of the fence, making it perfectly true to the saw. When driving the insert nuts, recess them just below the surface of the wood so that way the fence can sit flush with the miter gauge. With the fence attached, we can now trim it. Make sure that the saw blade is perfectly upright so we can achieve 90-degree corners on the fence. With the fence attached, we can start using it. I'm going to go ahead and square off all four sides of the slider for the stop block. The slider will run along the top of the fence. To make it stay centered on top of the fence, we can add a rail on the bottom side of the slider. The rail should be equal width to the T-slot groove that we put on the top of the rail. Cutting this rail is very similar to cutting a rabbet, only you're going to cut two on the same side. Moving back over to the miter fence, we can cut out the maximum height that we will need for a slider. The maximum height that we'll need is that to attach the stop to the slider. You'll see that in future steps. Now I'm going to cut away some of the waste. Note, I should not have done this on a table saw. I should have done this purely with a handsaw. However, in my own idiot fashion, I decided to try cutting a little bit of it on the table saw. Don't do that. I'm cutting out the waste here to accommodate the T-slot bolt. My bolt is only about 1.5 to 2 inches tall and cannot go through this entire block. Drilling out the hole for the T-slot bolt could have been done before making the rail. As you noticed here, I had some serious chip out, which resulted in damage to the rail. However, for my purposes, there was plenty of rail for the project to continue forward without having to restart on a new block. Just cleaned it up with a chisel, and we're good to go. The stop is the last thing we need to make, and we could use the pieces we've already made to outline a good shape for a stop. There'll be an L shape to fit around the fence, and then a nice square spot on top of it to be able to attach it to the slider. I decided that I would not mess with the table saw in an unsafe manner and would cut the stop out with the back saw. I like to use a table saw because it guarantees a straight cut. However, I was really pleased that I was able to get a nice straight cut with my back saw. But of course, the first chance I get, I'm going to take this thing back to the table saw to make the final cut. As you keep working on projects, you learn more and more things, and decided this time to avoid the chip out that I experienced, I would take the proper precaution and use some tape. The hole only needs to be big enough to accommodate the bolt that will be used to tighten down the stop block. That hole will then be transferred to the slider, so that way we can find the location for the insert nut to secure the stop block to the slider. Miter gauge parts, assemble! That's right, it's time for assembly. This should be fairly straightforward. A couple notes on this project. The slotted T-bolt, I made that myself from an elevator bolt. I have another video on that. The other hardware I purchased at Lowe's. I did not find what I wanted at Home Depot. Neither of those is a sponsor of my channel. In fact, I don't have any sponsors at this point. So if you are a sponsor, you can go ahead and check out my channel. I used some wood wax to go ahead and smooth out the T-track, and that allowed the slider to move much more freely. And as you saw there, I used the combination square to measure out how much I wanted to cut off of this wood stock. And I'm just doing a couple repeat cuts here of 4 inches. Next we can do some angled cuts. The angled cuts are a little more difficult on this as an angle pulls the fence away. So the way my miter gauge is hinging, it pulls the fence away when we angle out, and if I was to angle in, it would pull my fence into the saw until it will at least reach the 45-degree angle. So those are some of the shortcomings of this. If you're planning on doing a lot of those angled cuts, you might consider making a fence, maybe not as complicated as this one, but it could be, just for those cuts itself. I'm really happy with this project, and I think that it'll help me lift my woodworking to the next level. And if you enjoyed this video and like to support me, go ahead and click that subscribe button. Let me know how you think I'm doing in the comments, and share this with any of your like-minded woodworking friends.